So sexual homicide is a specific type of homicide that involves a sexual component. But it's not always easy to define. There are some major problems with the definition. For one, because there is no legal definition. There is no charge of sexual homicide in the legal system. You have to look at case files or specifics of a crime to really know it was a sexual homicide. So that means that crime statistics are often not really reflective of the true rate of sexual homicide. There's also a lot of confusion of terms in terms of what's lust murder versus serial versus mass murder. A general distinction has been made between killings that are carried out specifically for sexual gratification purposes, which those are lust murders, and killings that occur in the context of sexual acts or sexual offenses where the motive for the killing is not sexual gratification. So a lust murder means that the person is killing and that killing is the source of their sexual gratification. And then there's also the distinctions between those lust killings, which would be a homicide where the homicide itself produces the sexual gratification. But then you also have rape killings, which is where you have a homicide either during or following a rape, or killings after sex or after rape to destroy evidence. So those are very different motives for killing somebody, but they all have that sexual component. And then, of course, there's also the confusion of serial and mass murder, which we're going to talk about in a second here. But obviously not all serial and mass murders have a sexual component, but a lot of them do, which is why there's some overlap there. But so when we look at the definition from the FBI definition basically says a murder is of a sexual nature when it includes at least one of these elements. So the victim's attire might be dressed in a specific way, for sexual purposes, or they're nude, or there's exposure of sexual parts of the victim's body. So often the victim is still clothed, but a woman's skirt will be lifted up, or her breast will be exposed, or something like that. That could make it a sexual homicide. Sexual positioning of the body. This could occur in terms of just sort of how the offender leaves the body to be found. Sometimes they put them in a very sexual position. Insertion of foreign objects into body cavities. So if things are found in body cavities, and then that could be sexual nature. Evidence of intercourse, obviously, would be one. And this could be oral intercourse, vaginal intercourse, or anal intercourse. And also, sometimes there could just be evidence of substitute sexual activity, interest, or sadistic fantasy. And typically that manifests as evidence of masturbation at the scene or mutilation of sexual parts of the victim's body. So specific parts of the victim's body are mutilated that are clearly sexual parts of the body. So if one of these is present, then it may be considered a sexual homicide. But if multiple of these things are present, then it probably is a sexual homicide. So it's kind of, it's a little hit or miss for some of these things. I mean, if there's no other sexual component besides what seems to be a sexual positioning of the body, is that really sexual homicide? Like, some of those are tough to decipher, which it's not easy. There's no clear cut here, this is a sexual homicide and this isn't. But these sort of are some of the things to look for something that would be considered a sexual homicide. So, the FBI then also has come up with a typology of sexual murders in particular. So, we're not talking about all murders. These are just sexual murderers. This was developed at the FBI Behavioral Science Unit, and it grew out of a study of only 36 sexual murderers. So that's kind of, you have to take this with a grain of salt. They are collectively responsible for 118 victims, but that's still a pretty small sample to come up with a typology to explain all sexual homicide. But it has kind of held fairly true. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So you have the crime variables here at the top. So this is crime scene variables, and profile characteristics here on the bottom. So basically the two main types of sexual murders that came from the FBI, you have your organized and your disorganized. So you look at the crime scene variables. So the organized offender or offense is a very planned offense, whereas disorganized is more spontaneous. Organized, typically it's a stranger victim or target, because if the person is organized, they're going to choose targets that can't be connected to them. Whereas a disorganized offender is going to choose somebody who is known to them, or they're going to commit the crime in a location that is clearly that they know and that they spend time in. The organized offender, the crime scene reflects control. So, there's not things randomly strewn about and there's not evidence left. Whereas the disorganized offender, the crime scene is very random, it's sloppy, there was no cleanup, or, there's nothing about trying to keep evidence from being found. The organized offender often uses restraints, partly to sort of reduce the amount of resistance that they're getting from the victim so that they can commit their crime as cleanly as possible. Also, they tend to hide the body so that it's not as easily found. Sometimes they may position the body in a specific way and it's to send a specific message. That could still be an organized offender, but often the body is just hidden and so it's harder to find. It takes longer. It's much more degraded by the time it's found. A disorganized sexual homicide offender, they're not going to use restraints. The body's just going to be left in view. And it's because, again, they're not planning. They didn't plan any of this. And so they're just flying by the seat of their pants, doing whatever they can in the moment. An organized offender, there's going to be aggressive acts prior to death. So it'll be about subduing the victim and being able to commit the offense. Whereas the disorganized offender, typically you're going to see sexual acts after death. And so it'll be like, oh, well, oops, I accidentally killed her. Well, I might as well have sex with the body. That kind of thing is a disorganized offender's way of thinking. And an organized offender is there's not going to be evidence at the scene. There's not going to be the weapon. Everything's going to be gone, as cleaned up as best they can, at least. Whereas a disorganized offender, weapons left at the scene, evidence is all over the scene. There's no cleanup really at all. So those are kind of what the crime scenes themselves look like and the information you can get from the crime scene. And then the profile characteristics that would come out of that then is the organized offender tends to be more intelligent. They're also socially competent. They're that person that you would never expect to have done something like this. Whereas the disorganized offender, they're average or lower intellect, socially immature, the creep factor. The organized offender is going to have a skilled work history. They're living with a partner. Again, it's those people you don't expect to do these crimes because they're good at hiding their true nature. Whereas the disorganized offender, they're going to have a bad work history, in and out of jobs. Maybe they're just unemployed and living alone because they might have had partners in the past, but they can't keep a partner for any length of time. The organized offender may use alcohol with their crime, either for themselves or for the victim, but it's part of that planning process. Whereas the disorganized offender, they're not going to think to use alcohol. But an organized offender might use that alcohol as a way to subdue their victim or to sort of get over their own inhibitions so they can do what they really want to do. The organized offender is going to have mobility of some kind. Typically, they have a vehicle of some kind and it's in good condition. And the disorganized offender is not going to have that, and they're going to live or work near where the crime scene is. So they're not going to be able to have gone far away to commit their crime. So again, that kind of comes back to the fact that the location is known to them. The organized offender is going to follow the crime in the media. They want to know that they're getting away with this. They want to know if the police are getting close so that they can they need to move the body if it hasn't been found yet or something. They're going to really follow the crime in the media. Disorganized offender is going to have minimal interest. They hear their name that might perk their interest, but they're not going to think to follow it to see how the police are doing. So that's kind of the main, or your organized versus your disorganized. And there's been some criticisms where people say that it can't really account for all sexual homicides, and so a mixed type has been used by some people who use this typology as sort of in the middle. So they're not super organized, but they're not super disorganized, and so it's kind of a mixed in the middle. And also the FBI, the BSU never really explained how they came up with it in terms of the methodology, the clinical and statistical analyses used. So there's been sort of some criticism that has come from that. But it is a good typology that's been used by a lot of people to sort of help catch some of these people in terms of coming up with the profile and sort of explain their offending. This is, if you're interested in reading more about something like this, this is a research article that I wrote, and it's all about solved and unsolved sexual homicides, and it's so it looked at crime scene factors, and so we kind of came up with typology, our own typology that kind of is very similar to the FBI typology. There's some stuff in common there, but also brings into account some other factors, So it's pretty interesting, especially because then we look at the cases that are solved versus the ones that remain unsolved and kind of what's the difference. And so it's a pretty interesting article if you're interested.